And just as a reminder, for more Microsoft webcasts, you can visit Microsoft.com/webcasts. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's MSDN webcast, VisualBasic.net Soup to Nuts. Today's session is Visual Basic and SQL Server 2005. And now without any further delay, I'm going to turn the floor over to today's presenter, Ron Cundiff.
All right. Thank you very much, Tracy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webcast. This is another session in our webcast series where we're covering all the basics of VisualBasic.net from soup to nuts. So in today's session, our topic is Visual Basic and SQL Server 2005. So we're going to introduce SQL Server 2005, and then we're going to discuss how SQL Server and Microsoft Visual Studio have such tight integration and how that really helps us in building applications based upon data. And then, of course, we'll cover exactly how we can utilize data binding to very simply be able to display and update data on either our web forms as well as our Windows forms for our applications as well. And then in the last section, we're going to cover how we can actually accomplish the same thing with code. So first of all, let's go ahead and introduce SQL Server 2005. Hopefully everyone's aware. Hopefully everyone has some basic knowledge about database features and so forth. SQL Server 2005 comes in a few different editions. We're actually covering, because we're covering the basics of Visual Basic in this series, we're actually going to utilize a specific version of SQL Server 2005, which is completely free. So if you've been following this series, you have experienced an introduction to Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition, Visual Web Developer 2005 Express Edition. These are completely free products that you can use to help you gain understanding and to play around with the various languages that are available to you in the .NET framework, completely free of charge. Well, SQL Server 2005 has a similar edition. This is known as the Microsoft SQL Server 2005 Express Edition. Completely free. It is a file-based database, and it's important to point out that it's a complete database engine. So we can actually write our queries in Transact SQL, which is the language that we utilize for basically being able to query and modify and update data and so forth. It also has support for indexes, advanced features, stored procedures. We can take advantage of a lot of the features that are available to us in the other editions of SQL Server 2005 as well, such as enforcing code security through Windows-based authentication and so forth, or roles-based security. We can add triggers to tables and so forth, user-defined functions, user-defined types. I mean, all these types of features that we may be familiar with using some other editions of SQL Server 2005. All of these features are available to us in the Express edition of SQL Server 2005 as well. So, really, truly, it provides us with a means to be able to have a completely free product where we can kind of play around with data type functionality and become familiar with the SQL Server environment and kind of learn Transact SQL, as well as having the capability of graduating past that a little bit and learning more about some of the advanced features, how we can optimize indexes. We can play around with the Express Edition to be able to accomplish that and be able to write stored procedures to encapsulate functionality, as well as some of the other advanced features that I listed out here. So it's really a very, very nice product for being able to get our feet wet with the technology and to learn a little bit more about data manipulation. So we're going to go ahead and let's go ahead and just introduce SQL Server 2005 Express Edition, show you how you can get it, and then kind of what it looks like once you do download it. So I'm switching to a code sharing demonstration. Now my resolution is set to 1024 by 768. If your resolution is that or higher, you can press F5 on your keyboard to view this code sharing demonstration in full screen mode. And then of course you can just hit F5 again when we return to the slide deck to restore the view that you had previously. So I just wanted to point out where you can go to download this free edition of SQL Server. So you'll notice I'm looking at an IE window here, and basically I just went to Microsoft.com/SQL/Express as a shortcut, and it kind of redirected me to the landing page for the Express edition of SQL Server 2005. You can actually see the full URL there, where it's actually the landing page actually resides Microsoft.com/SQL/Edition/Express/default.mstx. And so from here, this is where you can learn more about it. This is where you can get samples. You can see one of the first links that we can actually click through here is, if we're brand new to development and we're really not sure exactly what the purpose of SQL Server Express is, or maybe we've never really dealt with data or anything of that nature, you can see that we've got some resources to kind of help you get started, as well as here you can see 5 absolute beginners videos to help you get started. So even if you've never worked with database applications before, you can certainly use this edition of SQL Server 2005 to become familiar with how to organize data, how to set up tables, how to set up certain different objects within our database, how to write transact SQL queries to be able to query the data out, as well as taking you through some of the more advanced features of SQL Server as well. Now, once you go to this site, you'll see the link over here on the right. I may have to scroll over just a little bit because of my resolution here. But one of the links you'll see on the right when you go to this landing page for SQL Server 2005 Express Edition is the ability to go to the download page for it. So over here to the right, you'll see the link, Get SQL Server 2005 Express. If you click through that, then it'll actually take you to first of all, we have the capability to either register for additional benefits. Here you can see that, that by registering SQL Server Express Edition, we do have access to additional benefits that we don't get if we elect not to register. But we don't have to register. We could just go ahead and say no thanks and go to the download page. Now it is important to point out that it does require the .NET Framework 2.0 to already be installed, and it does require that we are not currently running any previous beta versions or CTP versions or tech preview versions of SQL Server, Visual Studio, or the .NET Framework itself. So if we're running any previous beta versions or CTP versions of the .NET Framework before the release version of the .NET Framework 2.0, we're going to have to uninstall those and ensure that the .NET Framework 2.0 itself is properly installed. So just wanted to point that out for those of us that are just kind of getting started with SQL Server Express. And then here you can see, further down on the page, we've got a couple of different options. We can go ahead and install just the core of what we need. Here you can see I can actually click on this More link where it'll actually expand out and give us a really detailed description of exactly what these different components are. So here you can see that I can just install just a very lightweight version of SQL Server 2005. And here you can see, even with the very lightweight version, it does point out that we do have deep integration with Visual Studio 2005. And so therefore, I can just start off with the base version. Personally, if you really want to take advantage of progress your skills from just the basics of the functionality available to you in Express. But then as you progress, you may want to get into some of the more advanced features, such as reporting services and full text search and things of that nature. I would actually recommend that you probably go ahead and install the SQL Server 2005 Express Edition with Advanced Services. That way, as your skills progress, you've already got the tools available to you in order to play around with some of the more advanced features as well. Another important point to this is that as part of this installation of SQL Server Express, we actually get this SQL Server Management Studio Express, which is a graphical tool that we can use for modifying our databases, configuring them, and setting them up and so forth. So it makes it very easy to be able to administer our databases and set them up and configure it and so forth, utilizing the SQL Server Management Studio, which is very similar. It's got a very similar look and feel and user interface to it than very similar to Visual Studio. So if we're already kind of familiar with that graphical environment, then the SQL Server Management Studio will be somewhat familiar to us. Now, continuing further on down the page, I'd just like to point out too that you more than likely you want to go ahead and install some of these samples as well as the books online. The samples installs the AdventureWorks sample database, so there's a lot of examples of how you do certain things and how you take advantage of certain features. What do select statements look like in Transact SQL? How do I update data? What kind of syntax do I use in Transact SQL to update data? What's a stored procedure, and how do I write a stored procedure, and then how do I call it from code, and things of this nature. So these samples will be very useful to you, especially if you're just starting out with SQL Server and you're really wanting to really learn by getting your hands dirty, getting your hands on it, and kind of walking through some of the code and some of the setup and configuration of the sample databases. It'll really help you out. And then, of course, the reference application, the books online, is really exactly what you may think. It's complete documentation for SQL Server 2005, and it puts this on your desktop so that you don't always have to be connected to get help. Typically, by default, it won't install SQL Server Books Online, so anytime you try to get help in SQL Server, it'll actually point you back to the online documentation. So this would be the Books Online is also very, very useful, especially when you're learning and you need to get examples in Books Online. There's a ton of examples and samples and complete documentation on all the functionality that's available to us with SQL Server. So I would recommend that option as well. Now, once you install this, what it's going to do is if you install the advanced version of it, which does include SQL Server Management Studio Express, then this, like I said, this is a graphical tool that provides you with the capabilities of manipulating your database utilizing this graphical tool, and it's very similar in its user interface to Visual Studio. So if you're familiar with Visual Studio, you'll be somewhat familiar with the user interface for this. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on the Management Studio Express. And then the first thing that pops up here is it actually prompts me which server I want to connect to. Now it's important to point out here that I've actually got SQL Server 2005 Enterprise Edition and SQL Server 2005 Express Edition installed on the same machine. So if you work in a corporate environment where you need to connect to enterprise instances or different editions of SQL Server, this Management Studio will actually do that as well. It's also important to point out that if you do have SQL Server 2005 Enterprise installed and you have the SQL Management Studio installed with it, then you can likewise connect to SQL Express editions for database instances as well. So that's kind of where this comes in, where it's really specifying, what server name, and this is the name of my machine, and then also what instance name. So I can actually have multiple instances installed on the same machine, which really act like completely separate databases for all intents and purposes. So that's kind of where that server name is coming from. It's my machine name plus the instance name of the database I want to connect to. And then, of course, I installed SQL Express for Windows authentication, so I'm just going to go ahead and select that as the default. And then what it's going to do is here you can see in the left we have the Object Explorer, where I can kind of navigate through the different objects that are contained within my SQL Express instance here. And here you can see there are different categories for the functionality, for the objects that are contained within my server. So, I can configure logins. Here you can see that it's actually got some logins for my accounts set up in certain roles for the server so that I can easily administer it when I connect to utilizing my Windows account and so forth. And then, of course, it's pretty intuitive. So I can just go over here in this tree view-like control, navigating the objects, and I can say, you know what, I want to go ahead and create a new database. And then I can just specify, a name for the database itself, test data, and then utilize some of the default settings. These settings are important to understand how they affect the configuration of your database. But at the same time, if you're just starting out, you may just want to go ahead and leave the defaults for now, and then just so you can kind of become familiar with what what a database looks like and working with the individual objects of a particular database contained within this instance of SQL Server. And then maybe once you become familiar with some of the initial objects and so forth, you can kind of come back and then look at what all these different options are that are available to you when you create these databases to understand exactly how to tweak your database for your specific purpose. And then I can just go ahead and click OK, and it'll actually create a database for me. Here you can see it's now created a database. Now within this database I have individual objects that are related specifically to this particular database. So this is an instance of SQL Express running on my machine. And then as you can see, I can have multiple databases contained within this single instance is what this is. And so then I can drill down into the database itself, and here you can see that this is how I can navigate through different tables that are associated, and it's really easy. I can just right click and select new table, and it'll actually give me a little user interface here where I can go ahead and type column names and then the data type for this particular column, and then specify options for the different columns within my database itself. So as you can see, it does provide a nice graphical interface that I can use for creating my databases, modifying my databases. This is how I can come back in here and I'm not going to save that table. I just wanted to kind of demonstrate that. But here I could come under programmability, and then I could write a new stored procedure, for instance. And here you can see that I got nice color syntax highlighting for my Transact SQL, which is the language that I'd use to write a stored procedure within SQL Server and things of this nature. So as you can see, it really provides me with a nice graphical interface, and it's actually really and truly behind the scenes. This is the Visual Studio shell. It's just modifying an instance of SQL Server as opposed to modifying an application project, for instance. But it's actually the same shell. And so therefore it's very similar in its user interface to Visual Studio. So if I'm used to Visual Studio, then I'll certainly be used to the user interface within this SQL Server Management Studio Express. So just wanted to kind of give a brief overview. Obviously there's a lot of functionality we could cover. I could do an entire session just on this user interface and how to go about building a database and so forth. But just wanted to give you an overview of what SQL Server Express Edition is. There are many different versions of SQL Server. SQL Server Express is the file-based database system that's completely free from Microsoft. And then I wanted to point you to where you could actually go to download SQL Server Express. All right, so let's go ahead and switch back to the slide deck. And now let's talk about the really exciting part of this, and that is how deeply integrated SQL Server is with Visual Studio. You actually, within Visual Studio, we have a window, a pane within the Visual Studio user interface for modifying databases and exploring through a database, the Database Explorer window. Then we also have some other tools available to us at our disposal. We have data-bound controls that we can easily sync these up to our databases, and really without writing any code. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you. We're going to walk through an example here in just a moment where we're going to go ahead and create a database, and then display data from that database without writing a single line of code. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't programmatically control this, of course. I mean, hey, we're developers. We have to have a lot of flexibility in our application. So sometimes we may want to write the code ourselves to access this data and then display this data within the user interface of our application. And so when we need to do that, then basically what we do is we tap into the functionality that's provided for us in the .NET framework that's contained within the system.data namespace. Specifically when we're dealing with SQL Server and SQL Server Express, specifically we're looking for the system.data.SQL client namespace. So we'll kind of walk through a couple of different examples of doing this. So here let's just go ahead and show you how it looks within Visual Studio. So we're going to switch back to a code sharing demonstration. And I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio here. And here I've created just a simple little website. I haven't done anything to it yet. It's actually just the default template that I use, the ASP.NET website template when I did file a new website from the Visual Studio menu. And then and of course selected the Visual Basic language because that's what we're covering in this session, or actually in this entire series. And so I'm just getting this is just the default template. And here you can see it's got the lovely untitled page for my default.aspx page. So let's just go ahead and see what kind of integration we have with Visual Studio and SQL Server. So as you can see, I am completely in Visual Studio here, and so what I can do is I can just go ahead and I'm going to right-click. Now, within a web application, within ASP.NET 2.0, the ASP.NET 2.0 has special folders for containing specific types of items. So for instance, any code that we're going to include, like in our own custom classes within our web application, we would want to standardize and put that in a special folder specifically for that, and that is the app code folder. Well, we've got a similar folder available for data as well, and that's the app_data folder. So I'm going to right-click on that folder, and then I'm going to go ahead and select a new item to add to this. And then I'm going to select a SQL database file. And I'm just going to give it a nice name, not my database. And so what it did was it actually created an MDF file, which is the extension that is used for an individual file-based database that we're using here in SQL Express. And then as you can see, another thing that it did is that it actually it defaulted to show me this Server Explorer window. And under that Server Explorer window, it lists out data connections, and then within data connections it has a reference to the database file that I just created. And so from here I can go ahead and modify my database that I've just created directly within Visual Studio. So for instance, if I just wanted to go over here and take a look at what kind of tables are contained. Now this is a completely blank database, so I don't currently have anything in this database. So let's just go ahead and just walk you through the simple matter of creating a table. A table is an entity that contains the actual data itself in individual fields or columns. And so I'm just going to right-click on the Tables node, and I'm going to select Add a New Table. Now, the reason I did this in SQL Server Management Studio and then came back over to Visual Studio and did it from within here is that you'll notice it's the exact same interface, right? So it makes it really easy working with data from within Visual Studio because I basically have the same functionality as I do from the Management Studio. And it's the same interface, and so I can switch back and forth between these tools depending on my preference or what have you, and really be able to apply my knowledge to both environments. So I was really glad to see this in the latest versions of Visual Studio and then SQL Server that we really streamlined this interface and then provided a consistent interface across our different tools, so you can really use the tool of your choice. And here, I'm just going to completely stay within Visual Studio. So I'm going to go ahead and add some columns to this table. So I'm going to add an ID column, and I'm going to have it be an integer data type. I'm going to specify that this cannot contain any null values. And then I'm also going to use some properties. Here you can see these are properties for the individual column that I'm adding within this table. And within this table, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a special feature. And I'm going to make this column an identity column. And basically what that means is that it's going to generate a new value based on the increment here for every record that is added to this table. So think of the individual columns within the table as a blueprint for containing the data. And then what you'll do is you'll store individual data items within these columns within this table. And then of course a table is a group of related information that needs to be stored similarly. And so here I've just created one column, and then I'm just going to go ahead and let's just create a couple more columns just for demonstration purposes. So I'm just going to specify a first name and a last name in varchar. basically is going to contain Unicode data of a Unicode character data of a varying length up to a maximum of 50. Is basically what this is telling us. And then lastly, what I'm going to do for this table is I'm going to right-click on the ID column itself, and then I'm going to assign the ID column as the primary key. So in database development, you always want to ensure that you have a unique ID where you can reference individual records within your table. And so therefore, I've assigned this ID column as my primary key column, and so therefore it's ensured to be unique, and then I can always reference a record by its ID number. So it makes it very easy for cross-referencing from other tables and for writing queries to query back an individual record and so forth. So I mean, it's really and truly part of basic database design here. And so then I just got this very simple little table. I'm going to go ahead and save it, and we're going to call this the customers table. And so now, as you can see, my database contains a customers table, and here you can see contained within that customers table, it actually has 3 different fields. And another thing that you'll notice is that as I highlight these individual fields, notice that the properties window, which is where I'm accustomed to viewing properties for individual controls and things of that nature, I've got that same type of functionality for the individual columns that are defined within my customers table as well. Now obviously I can't modify from the properties window, because what I'd really need to do is I'd really need to come back to the customers table, right click on it, and open table definition so I can modify the definition of this table. So the properties window is really just useful for viewing the individual characteristics of an individual column within here and things of that nature. And you can see that it is context sensitive. So basically as I go through and highlight the individual elements, it'll give me certain properties for the type of element that I'm on. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of data to this table, which is really easy to do. I'm just going to right click on the customers table. I'm going to show some table data. And as you can see, currently this table does not contain any data. I just set it up. So I'm going to go ahead and add some data to this table. So let's just go ahead and add one customer. I'll just use my name. And then we can just add a couple more. Oops. I've got a few different customers in here. Notice that as I added data to these individual first name and last name columns, it did indeed automatically insert new IDs for these records based upon this being an identity value for that ID column. And so basically that's just ensuring that I don't have to specify an ID when I'm adding a record. It'll add that for me automatically in a sequential manner, and so therefore be sure to generate unique IDs for my every record that's contained within my table. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to do straight from within Visual Studio. We can just go in and create modify our database as necessary. I just kind of walked you through creating a simple little element, an initial table for our database, and then how we would go ahead and define a couple of columns, and then I also showed you how you can go ahead and add data to that table that we just created. All right, so now the cool thing about this is that we can actually use data binding, where we can actually tie data directly to controls that we place on the form. And then it's important to point out this is actually two-way binding. So basically what that means is that as the data would change, the control itself would change as well. There's no coding required. We can actually build a data application without writing a single line of code utilizing these data-bound controls. And of course it is dynamic binding, so as data changes, these controls will reflect these data changes. And there are a lot of different controls that we can use for data binding to our binding our controls to our data sources. So, one thing that comes to mind is the data grid view control, which is a very useful control, and it's very easy to set up a relationship to a data source. And like I said, we can actually do it without writing any code at all. So let's just go ahead and switch back over to the Visual Studio environment. for another code sharing demonstration. And let's just demonstrate just how easy it is to retrieve that data that we just added to our database. So here I'm looking at my default.aspx page. I'm going to switch over to the design view. And then I'm also going to switch over to my toolbox. Notice that these are just multi-tabbed to provide multiple types of functionality within the same toolbox pane. So I can switch back and forth between the toolbox and the Server Explorer to modify or to give me access to whatever functionality I'm kind of drilling into. So within my toolbox here, I'm going to expand the group of tools that are within the data category. And then I'm just going to drag and drop the grid view control over to my form. And so this context menu pops up when I drag and drop my grid view control over to my form on my default page. And as you can see, it's giving me a few different options here. One of which is to be able to choose a data source. So I'm going to go ahead and select a new data source. And what that's going to do is that's going to pop me up with a wizard that will kind of walk me through configuring a data source for use for my page. And here I'm just going to go ahead and select it as a data. There's a lot of different formats that we can use to get data from. Here you can see, we have the capability to retrieve our data from an Access database. We may have actually written a data tier, which is what we're going to be covering in a couple sessions of how to build a multi-tier business application. So we're actually going to cover writing your own data tier to actually customize completely how you retrieve data. So I can actually assign it to a class that I've defined that's going to be used for retrieving data, for instance, and it could just be a plain old XML file. Now, we're talking about SQL Server today, so we're going to go ahead and select a database data source. And then the next thing it's going to ask is, it's going to say, okay, which data connections should your application use to connect to the database? Now, because I'd already created my database and put it in my app data folder, then it's going to, one of my options in this dropdown is going to be the capability to connect to that database that I've added to my project. And then I can go ahead and save this connection string. And basically what this is going to do is this is going to save my connection string to my application configuration file. Since this is a web-based application, this is going to be web.config. And so it's going to add that connection information to web.config. And then, basically, here's just a little wizard. How would you like to retrieve data from your database? You can specify a custom SQL statement. So if you're very familiar with Transact SQL, feel free to write your own statement there. Also, if you've written a stored procedure that's going to be used to retrieve data for this data source, you can specify it there with the first option as well. You can also just specify, particular columns from a table or view. So, for instance, here you can see specify columns from a table or view. Which table would you like? I've only got the one table within my database, so it's my only option at this point. Then I can go ahead and select the columns. Now, for those of you not familiar with Transact SQL, star is just a special notation that indicates to retrieve all columns from the database. I don't like using star, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it's just as easy as just go ahead and select those columns. But I'm just going to go ahead and select the different columns in there. Select next. Go ahead and test my query. Make sure it's going to work and retrieve data. Here you can see it actually retrieved the data that's contained in my table. So I'm going to go ahead and finish here. And then, of course, another cool thing about the grid view is, obviously you can, apply some auto formatting to it and stuff like that if you'd like, or whatever. Another cool thing about the grid view is that, I can automatically enable, paging, sorting, the ability to select a specific record. So I mean, this is all kind of stuff that's just built into the grid view control within ASP.NET. So now I've actually given it access to. And what I've done is I've bound this grid view control to my data source. Now you'll notice that the wizard, that just kind of walked through it for me, it actually created a SQL data source tool on my page itself, which is a non-visible control that specifies how to connect to the data source itself. Another thing that we'll notice is that if we open up our web.config file, you can see, remember that option where we said, yeah, we want to save our connection string? Here is how it actually persisted that to make it available to our web application, is within the connection strings parameter, within the configuration element for our web application, it added a connection string to that, and then it specified how exactly to connect to the data. Here you can see data source, SQL Express. The file name itself that we want to attach can be found in the data directory, which is that app_data folder, and then the name of the database and things of that nature. So you can see that it generated this for us by utilizing that wizard. And so now what I can do, I mean, if I were to just run this page right now, it would actually just go ahead and display that data, or it should. So let's go ahead and view this in our browser and browse out to it and see what happens here. And as you can see, it actually did just display the data that's contained within our table that we configured this control to be bound to. Now, another cool thing is that we got other controls at our disposal. So a lot of times we'll pair a grid view with another type of control. Notice that I enabled selection, and basically what this allows the user to do is it created a column within the grid view itself where the user can just click on that column, and that would actually retrieve all of the data for that particular record. So it's a very common functionality to add to your data applications, is the ability to view all the data within a grid, within a list of the data, and then be able to drill down into an individual record within the table itself. This is very easy to do, and we're still not going to have to write any code for this. So I'm just going to drag a details view control over to my form. I'm going to go ahead and format it to where it looks kind of like the grid view control. Just to make it nice and pretty here. Choose data source. Now I could use the existing data source, but remember, that's just going to select all of the customers from our table. So I'm going to select a new data source. Once again, this is a database. And once again, I just want to use that same connection string because we're connecting to the same database. And then here, I'm going to go ahead and select these columns once again. Except this time, I'm going to specify a where clause. And here you can see that the wizard allows me to kind of build this where clause. So I'm going to say where ID is equal to, and for the source of the ID parameter, I want it to look for another control on this page. And that control would be my grid view control. And then I'm going to add that to the where clause. So basically, what I've just done is I've specified that the data to use for my details view control should be selecting all those columns that I specified in the previous window, except I want to ensure that the ID, the unique identifier for the record that I want to retrieve, matches whatever the unique identifier is for the grid view control on my page. So that basically enables the selection functionality. And then, of course, I could test the query if I wanted to provide a parameter. I'm just going to go ahead and click Finish on this. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this web page. We'll view this in a browser again. And as you can see, as I click on the select column within my grid view control, it actually navigates to that individual record, and it actually executes my SQL statement to retrieve just that record based upon the ID, and then I've bound that to my details view control so that I can display just that record of data. Now, it's important to note that as part of that wizard, I actually could have specified that the underlying data source is updatable. So for instance, I could have went in there and specified some additional options that said, oh, by the way, this data source is two-way data binding, meaning that not only am I going to retrieve data, but I'm also going to modify the data from here and then want it to persist back to the database. That's actually just another option that I could have specified on the data source itself. So just wanted to point that out. That right now this is a view-only mode. We're not really, it's not an edit box, but actually these controls are smart in that if we updated the data source itself and then enabled this functionality within the control, we still wouldn't have to write any code. We would actually display a text box where we could modify this data and then persist that data back to the database. So we could do that without writing any code as well, just by specifying some properties and some of these controls that we used. Let's see. Got a couple questions in the queue. So Ted's question is, where are the update, delete, insert links? That actually would have been on the advanced options in that wizard window when I specified what the data source was going to be. So I would have had to select that. All right, so maybe I'll show you that option in just a moment. If we've got a little bit of time, I'll come back to that and show you that option. Now, it's important to point out here that we did all of that without writing a single line of code. We can also, of course, programmatically access the data as well. And the way that we do this is through the use of a library that's built into the .NET framework known as ADO.NET. It actually stands for Active Data Objects, which is actually an old term, but it's kind of followed it through its life cycle here. ADO.NET gives us some objects that we can use to make it very easy to communicate to our database programmatically using code. So basically we have the connection object. The connection object represents a connection to a data source. Then we have the command object, which represents a command that we want to execute against the connection that we've set up. There are parameters that we can specify. So if our queries require parameters to be passed into the command itself, we have a parameters object that makes it easy to facilitate the use of assigning parameters to our individual commands as well. And then we have the dataset object. The dataset object itself is really like an in-memory database, if you will. A dataset object can contain one or more tables. It's completely in memory, and then we can programmatically interrogate properties on the dataset itself, as well as methods. There are a lot of different things that we can do with the dataset object. As a matter of fact, in an application I wrote not too long ago, I would actually populate a dataset object, and then I would serialize it out as XML to save it on the local machine for offline viewing capability of the data, for instance. So, I mean, the dataset itself is really the uber object, if you will, in ADO.NET, in that it gives you a lot of flexibility in what you can do with the data once you get it in memory. And so it's also important to point out here too, there's another object, we're not really going to talk about it today, but the data reader object, which is really more for just iterating through the data and spewing it out in a view-only mode, if you will. So I mean, there's actually one more object in there that you may want to take a look at. But let's just go ahead and walk you through an example of programmatically getting at this data. So I'm going to go ahead and close this application. And then I'm going to create a new project. And of course, this is going to be a Windows application. And then from here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in and add an existing item. And then let's see. I think I'll put it in VB SQL Web. Where without put that on the file system? Oh well. You don't mind if I just recreate it real quick, do you? So I just selected a SQL database file to add to my project. And by default, when I create a database file associated with my Windows application, it'll by default walk me through a wizard that'll create a data set for me. And then, of course, I could specify what objects I wanted contained within this data set. And then I could very easily tap into this data set. Now, I'm actually going to write code that's going to, that I'm going to show you how you can actually go through and query the data yourself and then bind that to an existing control in a form. So I'm not actually going to use this data set that's generated for me automatically. You can certainly, these strongly typed data sets that it generates, though, it certainly have a lot of features that you may be interested in checking out after this webcast. And so for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over here and I'm just going to, let's see, let's find a list box control. So I'm going to place a list box control in my form. And then I'm actually going to double click on the form. And what that'll do is that'll bring me back the event handler for the form load event. Now, one other thing that I needed to do here is notice what it did was it actually created a connection string parameter within my app.config file because this is a Windows-based application. And I'm going to give it a simpler name than the default name. I'm just going to assign it the my database connection string name. Notice that that it also, though, attaches this my database file to this application for us. So from here, what I can do, so basically what this means is that I can use this as the connection string for accessing data within my application. And then, of course, I need to go over here, and since we're using a new one, I need to go ahead and set up the same type of table here real quick. So I'm basically just specifying the same options that we saw in the previous demonstration here for creating this sample table to work against. All right, so now that I've created that data, and then let's also, I guess we need to go back and add some data for this one too, huh? All right, so now I've got a database, I've got a table, and I've got a few records in that table. So now let's take a look at the code that we actually use in order to programmatically get access to this data. So I'm going to go back to my code window. Now remember, I told you that that we can actually use the system data namespace, and we'll also need the SQL client namespace found within this database. Because the system data namespace actually has other namespaces in it for specific types of databases. So really and truly, SQL Server is just one of the types of databases you can connect to utilizing this tool and this namespace. So there's actually, if you've got an Oracle database or an Access database or, some other kind of database, you can certainly get to it utilizing the various other namespaces. Really and truly, any ODBC compliant database can get to. You'll also notice we're not going to use it today, but if I do system data.odbc, here you can see that that I've got some of the same capabilities available to me in a different namespace. So I just wanted to point that out there. All right, so let's go ahead and write a little bit of code. Now, one thing we're going to do is we're actually going to get the connection string from our app.config file. So in order to do that, what we're going to need to have access to is a class, the configuration manager class, that's available in the system.configuration assembly. So we're going to need to add a reference before we have access to that connection string that's located in our app.config file. So in order to do that, I'm just going to scroll down. I'm going to right click on the references, add a reference. Scroll down and find system.configuration in the list, and then go ahead and add a reference to that assembly. And then, of course, I can import the appropriate namespace here. And so basically what this gives me access to is this gives me access to the configuration manager class, which will make it very easy for me to read configuration settings out of my app.config file. So now I can start writing some code that's actually going to connect to this database. So basically what I need to do is I need to create a new instance of a SQL connection object. And then what I need to do is I need to specify the connection string for my new SQL connection object. And here's where that configuration manager class comes in handy. All right, and then of course I need to go back and whatever that long connection string name was, whatever the value is for the name attribute on my connection string element is what I would load in this text here. So basically I'm referencing it by name out of the app.config file. So this makes it very easy. If I change data sources or anything like that, I just go back to my app.config file, update the connection string to point to the new data source or what have you, and I don't have to rewrite any of my code. So this is just a good practice to use when you're going to programmatically access data utilizing code. And so now remember I told you that the connection object represents a connection to a database. So now that I've established that, now what I need to establish is I need to establish a command to issue against this database in order to retrieve data for it. So I'm going to go ahead and declare a command object. So that would be the SQL command object, because we're using the SQL client namespace. And then, of course, I can begin assigning some of the parameters here. So I can specify what the command type is going to be. Here you can see that I could just give it a table name, which will just bring back all records in the table. I could specify a store procedure if I had written a store procedure to retrieve this data. I can also just enter in just the text itself for the command. So I'm just going to go ahead and use just a very easy example here and just specify my own command text for this. And so of course, naturally, the next thing to do is to assign the command text. So now we can spend an entire session on just transact SQL as well. But I'm going to go ahead and just select the columns out of here. And do something a little tricky. Let's combine the first name and the last name column and alias those columns as a single column. So basically that's what my command is going to be. It's written in transact SQL, and I'm just going to pass off this command to the data source in order to retrieve data for my application. And then finally, of course, I'm going to assign the connection object associated with my command to the connection object that I've just created. And now normally I would need to, before I do any data operations at all, I would need to issue a connection open statement. Now I'm going to leave that commented out so you don't forget it. In our particular case, we're actually going to use a couple of other tools that are available at our disposal. One is a data set, which I told you about a few moments ago on the previous slide, which just represents an in-memory representation of a database, and a single data set can actually contain one or more tables within it. Now, in our example, it's just going to contain the one table that's really going to be represented by the results of the query that I associated with the command text above in my code. So let's go ahead and declare a data set to contain the results of that query. And it's just data set, sorry. And then Now, in order to populate this data set, I'm going to use another object that's available to me, which is known as a data adapter. And basically just think of the data adapter as the liaison between your query and or your command and the data set that you've just created. So basically the data adapter is your liaison between your control and then the data source itself. So I'm going to create a new data adapter. Why did my cursor jump all the way up there? That's odd. Okay, and data adapter. And then basically I'm going to pass in this command parameter. So basically what I'm saying is, hey, create me a new data adapter for talking to the database. Oh, and by the way, talk to the database using this command object that I've previously set up. And then what I can do is I can just call this data adapter and then the fill method and then pass in my data set here. So basically what that means is hey, go ahead and create this data adapter, base it on this command object, and then use this data adapter to fill this data set that I've created. So now, as a result of this line of code, as a result of this operation, my data set now contains all of the results from the query that I specified within my command object. So now the last step that I have is I simply need to update my list box control on my user interface and bind it to the results from that query, which again are found in the data set that I just filled with my data adapter. So here I basically just need to say me listbox1, and then there's a few different properties that I can specify. Here I'm going to specify the display member. So basically what I want to show within the interface itself. It's the name column, and really a name column is just using an aggregate of that first name plus a space plus the last name. So it's an alias. I alias that column to do a computation on it, just to combine those two values. It's no big deal within T-SQL. And then finally, I need to specify what the data source is. And I'm going to specify the data set. Now remember, I told you that a data set can actually contain one or more tables. I actually want to bind it to the first table. It's a zero-based index, so the first table within my data set is actually going to contain the results of my query. And so now if I hit F5, hopefully if I did everything right, I now have a list box that contains the results of the contents of my table. All right, so we took a look at SQL Server 2005. We introduced SQL Server 2005 Express Edition. And then we really showed you the integration, the very tight integration between SQL Server and Visual Studio. It makes it very nice when we're doing database development. I've been working with Visual Studio a long time, and I remember at times where you'd have to switch to 4 different tools all on your desktop and switch between windows just to be able to get data into your application and work with it that way. And it just wasn't as productive as it could have been. So I was very excited to see the very tight integration of these data management capabilities directly within Visual Studio. I'm hoping it will be as useful to you as well. Then we showed you a simple example of data binding for a web-based application. It's pretty easy. We didn't even write any code for that. We just drag and dropped a few controls over to our form and then specified through a couple of different wizards what the data source should be. And as you saw, it's pretty easy. And I just used a web-based example and then a Windows-based example just to kind of show you that it's really easy to do in either one. Both of those techniques will apply to either of those application types. So don't think that it was specific to the application type. I just showed you 2 different ways and wanted to show you, that it was just as easy to add data access application capabilities to a Windows-based application. It's just as easy to add it to a web-based application as well. And then, of course, lastly, I just showed you how if you were writing this with code, then it's pretty easy to do as well, utilizing the various objects that are available to us in ADO.NET. Now, I think I've used up the complete hour almost, but I'm still going to stick around for questions. So if you have a question about any of the content you saw today, go ahead and enter it into the question and answers pane. And before I turn it back over to Tracy, I would like to mention that in 2 weeks, I remember we did 2 sessions this week because I got a lot of travel next week, so I really didn't, I couldn't even find an hour in my schedule here to do a webcast next week because of all the travel. So in 2 weeks, we'll have the next session, and the topic for the next session is going to be Visual Basic Application Deployment Options. So we're going to take all the stuff we've learned in this series, and then we're going to show you how easy it is to deploy your applications utilizing VisualBasic.net. So with that, I would like to extend a thank you to everyone that attended today's webcast. And again, if you have a question, go ahead and submit it in the Q&A pane. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tracy. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ron. I do want to remind everybody that for more information, they can print a PDF of today's session. To do that, just go to the File menu in your upper navigation bar. Now, please feel free to continue to submit your questions in the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your live meeting screen. Also, I'm going to be posting a survey here in just a minute. If you would all please take a moment to fill that out before you log off. We really do appreciate your feedback. As a reminder for upcoming and previously recorded webcasts, you can visit Microsoft.com/webcast. You can go here to register for the remaining sessions in the series and also to access the recording of this webcast. Now, if you have any webcast content ideas, something out there you want to see and haven't yet, we'd love to hear from you. Take note of this link here. And for anybody who's interested in receiving a free 14-day trial of Microsoft Office Live Meeting, you'll want to visit Microsoft.com/presentlive. And now for filling out that survey today, you're going to be automatically entered in to win this 30 gigabyte Zune digital media player. That gives you a little incentive to fill that out for us today. And here is the survey. Please follow the links provided to complete today's webcast evaluation. And with that, I do want to extend a very special thank you to Ron for your presentation today and for answering the questions we had come through the queue. I also want to thank the audience for attending today's MSDN webcast. Ladies and gentlemen, this will conclude today's session. The audience may now disconnect from the audio portion of today's presentation.